Excellent. Good morning, everyone. Good morning to those online and freezing here in the shop. Yeah, but we get the coffee, so there are some advantages. Before I forget, actually, just to say there will not be a share next Sunday. So next Sunday there will not be a share, and I hope this will be the last share on Zionism. So I'm open to nominations of future topics, and as I've said previously, those who join live get a double vote. So if you're online, you also get an opportunity to input ideas, but those who are live get double votes. So I am open for nominations of future topics. I would like to try and finish Zionism today. I came out wrong, but you get what I'm saying. Okay, so we looked last week at the Satmar Rebbe's position, Satmar Rav's position, and as I said then, in and of in itself, it's a view that deserves to be thought about and heard for two reasons. First of all, because he is not a marginal figure in Jewish thinking. He's a major and significant figure, and therefore not one that can that can just be ignored. I'm not talking about later iterations of the view, which I will address today, but for now I'm talking about the primary perspective that he offered, and it's a view that needs to be heard. And I tried to also present in the last share how beyond the sort of shalosh shavuos, the three oaths issue, which everyone's sort of become very obsessed by and has sort of become the major focus of discussions around his view, there was a sort of philosophical issue that he was raising around some of the core questions of what it means to have a Jewish state and whether this is something that's possible pre the Messianic era. Now, what I didn't get up to is what's happened around that viewpoint over the last 80 years. And this is where it sort of begins breaking down. Because what may have been a legitimate perspective, not may have been, he was a great figure and he was entitled to a view in the range of Jewish thinking. So what was a perspective of a great man pre the building of the state, and perhaps even in the early years of the state, becomes increasingly problematic. Because if you have an ideology that this is fundamentally and at its core a corroded endeavor, a dangerous, a spiritually dangerous endeavor, one which is driven by an attempt to recreate Judaism in a deeply and profoundly destructive way, it's a supreme act of rebellion. If you're going to adopt that stance, how do you deal with it becoming ever more different, with ever more differentiated from the reality on the ground? How do you deal with the fact that Israel has been an astonishing success, not just by secular measures, but by the most frum and religious measures possible? So how do you deal with a flourishing of frum life, a flourishing of Orthodox life, a flourishing of Torah learning, a flourishing of Jewish life in general, a flourishing of counter-assimilationism, and also miraculous or near miraculous survival of a small state in an exceptionally hostile world? So what do you make of all of that? In other words, whilst you might be able to claim 100 years ago, or even 50 years ago, you know what, we should all be moving to America. Israel is going to be a disaster, and why would you settle there? Why wouldn't you go to America? What are you meant to say now when the evidence is clear on the grounds that this has actually been a vital force for the maintenance of Jewish identity and the survival of Jewish identity, and it's been counter-assimilationist in the extreme? Now, you may say, well, that was predictable 100 years ago, that was predictable 80 years ago, and the Satmar Rebbe even at the time was on the wrong side of history. Who knows what was knowable 100 years ago? And which of us can read the tea leaves of history successful? But what we can more easily do is reflect backwards. And certainly, as far as things have gone so far, by any measure or criteria of success, even religiously, despite the culture conflict in Israel, and despite all the problems, and despite the secular decline, and all the things that we could list that are still problematic and disturbing about life in Israel, it's been an incredible endeavor. So how do you deal with that when you have a stance that says, this is fundamentally a rebellion, fundamentally a problem, fundamentally counter-Jewish, fundamentally anti-religious and destructive of religious forces? What do you make of what I think most of us see as Nissim in 48, in 67, and 73, and going onwards? How does one handle what seems to have been an incredible Jewish journey and revival post-war in Eretz Yisrael, in the lands of Israel? So to address this, Satmar has had to develop ever more a flavor or a nuance in the Satmarav's thinking and sort of build out of it something more significant. And this language of the Sitra Achra, of the state being a product, or Zionism being a product of the forces of evil, Sitra Achra, literally the Aramaic for the other side, for the influence of the Satan, of the Yetzer Hara, on the running of history, has to become ever larger. Because what you have to say is that all this success and all this miraculous survival and this flourishing of Jewish life is all driven by the forces of evil, of Sitra Achra, of that which is negative. And it shifts into what seems a more and more difficult sort of pseudo-Kabbalistic reading of history, in which wonderful things can happen, and yet we're meant to see it as some form of elaborate conspiracy theory. It's some form of, well, this is all an Nisoyan, this is all a trial, this is all a temptation. And the more it succeeds spiritually, the more this is just a demonstration of no, don't get distracted by this flourishing. This is all part of this illusion spun by the Satan in order to trick us and fool us. And this is fed by the forces of evil and temptation. And this is very problematic theologically, because the idea that we do believe that we live in a world in which, as humans, we have to make choices. And we live in a world in which there are evil options open to us as people which we can follow. But there's very, very thin strands of Jewish thinking that would accept the idea that this is a conspiracy of sorts, that it's feasible that Hashem would set out to trick us, that there would be evil just put in place as an illusion, and most of the temptation that we face in life is in our thinking seems to be things which are fundamentally good and positive, but we need to learn how to channel and use in the correct way. So the pleasures of life, the material appreciation of life, these are not negative things in mainstream. And certainly in Kabbalistic thinking, these are not negative things. These are positive things. We need to learn how to use and channel in the right way. Don't let ourselves become unduly materialistic. Don't let materialism be an end in itself. But the basic human drives of engagement with the world and engagement with others and society and community and relationships and connection, these are positive drives which we need to learn to channel in the right direction. And of course, they can be open to abuse. The idea that you can have a whole decades of Jewish history, which ostensibly seem to be a positive fulfillment of Jewish history, and the argument that this is all part of an elaborate trap or hoax set by the Satan, by the Yetzer Hara, to seduce us away from connection to Hashem, seems very, very difficult. So the point I'm trying to make in my conclusion of the presentation of the Satmarav, and again, anyone who's only heard this part and not what I said last week, please also listen to what I said last week. Because last week I spoke, and he doesn't need my respect. My respect is meaningless. But I shared what I believe is the truth, that we're talking here about a very, very serious Jewish thinker. He was a world-class Talmud Chacham and Gan in Torah, and he presented a voice that we will revisit right at the end of the discussion, because he raised uncomfortable questions that need to be asked, and the conversation became richer, no doubt, through what he said, and he was entitled to an opinion. And as I said, in the Dati Lomi world, some of his works are learnt quite seriously, because a conversation is richer when argued properly and correctly. However, the modern iteration of this viewpoint seems, Lanias Dati, in my humble opinion, to become ever more difficult and more problematic, because it has pushed its proponents into an extreme in which everything that seems to be taking place in the land of Israel has to be read through a negative lens, through a lens of this being yet an ever-growing illusion, elaborate conspiracy, elaborate hoax built by satanic forces out to trick the Jewish people into the Avodah Zarah, into the pagan worship and idolatry that is Zionism in this perspective. And it becomes very difficult. And I think, again, the modern iteration which we see in the extreme fringe ends of Satmar and the Torah, and again, this is not mainstream Satmar, but on the extreme fringe end in which they are rubbing shoulders with, virulent anti-Semites and obnoxious and horrible people, is part of a sort of ever greater distortion of a view which perhaps had basis in legitimacy, and was the view of a great man many decades ago, but I think has become ever more problematic as time has moved on. Sorry, Avram. Yes.
And it was anti-Zionist in 1948 in the sense that no Aguda member signed the Declaration of Independence. is one of the most Zionist parties around today.
Yes.
And depending how you define Zionism. And in any sense of the word, it was then what do you want to happen to Israel? It's going to come from.
Yes. So in this presentation, I argued that there were extremes. You had extreme anti-Zionism, extreme pro-Zionism from a religious point of view, and then you had moderate positions in the middle of mild anti-Zionism and mild pro-Zionism, and then neutrality, which in a sense I began in my presentation by saying that there was an argument for rabbinic neutrality here, in which this was a sociological theory of devoid of halachic significance. I'm going to agree with you and suggest that the Aguda was never Satmar, and it was formed to be anti-Zionism, but it had a version of anti-Zionism which allowed it to morph significantly. And you are right that it is a cautiously pro-Zionist movement in its current situation. And actually, the gap between classic Aguda and classic Mizrahi was a hair's breadth. It was not this wide gulf. When you really look at it, and evidence, for example, is a figure like Soloveitchik, who moved backwards and forwards in his life, and you even have historical remnants of this, in which the Ponevezh Yeshiva flew an Israeli flag on Yom Ha'atzmaut and continues to do so, and there are the history of Aguda is much more nuanced and complicated, and I think mainstream Haredim, whether they are comfortable using the term or not, are definitely Zionist in the sense that the most basic version of Zionism, which is that Jews, like other nations, have a right to a nation state, and that this nation state is one with which we will work and try and engage with positively and try and shift in a certain direction based on our philosophical views, is one that most Haredim would agree with. And in fact, again, you see this on the ground in terms of very significant engagement with the Rabbi, not nowadays, and various other things. So I agree with you. We're talking here about a wing of very extreme anti-Zionism, which theologically has become problematic, and it didn't have built into it the possibility of adapting to new scenarios, whereas the Aguda position, which was, I would label moderately anti-Zionist, did have the ability to adapt to new situations and evolved accordingly. So I agree with that. But for now, all we've really done is presented the Satmar Rav's position, and we still need to look at Rav Kook's position, which, again, I'm not equating the two in terms of how far they are along the spectrum, but for now I'm going to call the most significant or radical form of religious Zionism, and then we'll try and look briefly at the moderate positions in between. Yes? Yeah. No, to the best of the ability, they don't. I mean, you can't live in a country and not benefit from street lighting and rubbish collection and so on, but most of them avoid, if not all, avoid explicit government handouts. They will not take child benefits or the like. Yes. Some Hasidim work, by the way, yes. Yeah, absolutely, they work. Yeah. No, Satmar has always had a culture. One of the difficulties around sociological terms like Haredi or modern Orthodox, for that matter, is that all these terms are, if we think about the range of views within modern Orthodoxy, the range of views within Haredi Orthodoxy, these are such broad terms. This is the paradox of it, because in many respects, there's no Hasidic group, on the one hand, as narrow as Satmar. It has a very, very intense philosophy and a great deal of intolerance for irreligious philosophies and Zionism in particular. And on the other hand, it is a working group, and with enormous investment in chesed across Klal Yisrael. They are the people that, if you're in a mess and you're in their main centers in America and in parts of Israel, you will turn to if medical crises and financial crises and psychosociological crises, engage in incredible chesed across Klal Yisrael, undifferentiated to the recipients. They've been very, very active in numerous causes, and it sort of brings out the complexity of life and how hard it is to, the dangers of equating views and theologies with individuals. And it's very hard to know how to do. I think I may have mentioned even in this series, and I'm not comfortable with the story. I'll share the story as it is, and I don't know what to make of it. I happened to learn in a certain base of Medrash in Eretz Yisrael for a time, and I became friendly with a Hasidic person who sat next to me. And I discovered several years into the relationship that he was a member of a group who had broken away from the Torah Carta because the Torah Carta was not extreme enough from his point of view. So he considered the Torah Carta liberals. And I was pleased in a sense that I got to know him before I understood his theology, because it presented me with the full paradox of what do you do with that? When you're dealing with someone who has very, very, I don't want to say problematic, like enormously problematic views, terribly disturbing views, and as part of a movement, he himself personally hadn't sort of engaged in rubbing shoulders with terrorism and so on, but had a sort of a belief that I didn't even want to quote some of his beliefs because I don't even want to say the words, and yet I had got to know innocently and was a very fine, sweet, nice man and a good man who engaged in chesed and kindness, and it's a terrible problem how you balance the endless complexity of human nature. So for now, I'm not even talking about individuals. I don't want to talk about individuals. I'm talking about philosophies, and I'm avoiding talking about individuals. But there does come a point where you have to say someone has a philosophy that's so problematic that this has to reflect on the individual also. You can't just you can't always separate. I mean, if we translate this into other terms, into anti-Semitism and Nazism, racism, and so on, there does come a point where you have to say, however nice someone is, if they're spouting views, it has come a stop at a time where you stop your relationship with someone. But it's very, very difficult. And some, as an organization, we should just know, in the interest of fairness, is an enormous chesed project, probably the largest, maybe other than Chabad, is the largest, in a sense, outreach in its own way of Jewish people. Okay, so yeah. So there's a few points to say over here. So post-Holocaust, as I mentioned, something was really embedded in a even though I've sort of labelled this view Satmar, it was embedded in a Hungarian, Romanian culture, Jewish culture, that was profoundly anti-Zionist before the war, well beyond Satmar, Munkac, and many other groupings. There was also other streams of thought. So Satmar itself was a divided town. The Satmar Rav was not the only rabbi in Satmar. But by and large, the orthodoxy in that part of the world, probably very influenced by the Chassam Sofer and his sort of, again, Chassam Sofer predates the rise of modern Zionism, but the sort of cultural milieu of this atmosphere amongst the students and everything else was one of very extreme suspicion towards modernity, and was embedded in a culture of anti-Zionism, of which Satmar became the most prominent expression, and so on. Now, during and after the war, there were a number of theologies that adapted to and dealt with the Holocaust. There were those who said we got it wrong and we made a mistake and we now need to be Zionist, religious Zionist. Eim Habonim Smecha is the most famous iteration of that. He went through a mid-war conversion and ended up as a very significant proponent of religious Zionism, and wrote Eim Habonim Smecha, a work of religious Zionist theology. Those of you who still remember Rabbi Bernstein's Shurim will remember he used to quote it significantly, very beautiful sefer. Others use the Holocaust to reinforce their ideology. And this was mentioned last week, and I really, again, they're things that I don't want to say because I just feel so uncomfortable saying them. But there were those who read the suffering of the Holocaust as linked to Jewish mistakes and Jewish desire to assimilate, or the Jewish desire to be a nation like other nations. And I don't even want to go down that route. But there were those for whom the Holocaust reinforced anti-Zionist theology. There was a complicated question during the war about the issue, and before the war, in the desperate scramble to get certificates to enter into, at the time, British mandate Palestine, and who controlled those certificates and how they were allocated. And here we get to a very, very complicated part of Jewish history, which again, I'm not comfortable going into, and is deeply complicated, about how people behaved in desperate circumstances. And I don't want to go into this because none of us can judge, but there were problems in the behavior of all parties at that time. And it's very easy to sit here in the comfort of Hendon and point that out, but it's very, very complicated and challenging times. And people were scrambling over limited certificates to get in, and how are they allocated, and to what degree, but all sides built theology into this, to what degree some leaders behaved very nobly and sacrificed themselves to their flocks, and others took advantage of the access to things. These are very, very difficult times in Jewish history. And again, the idea of judging people as desperate is completely wrong. But broadly speaking, even most of those who were very profoundly anti-Zionist do not consider it problematic to take certificates to allow themselves into a British occupied or controlled British mandate Palestine. And their argument was that Eretz Yisrael belongs to all of us. And as I explained in early weeks, anti-Zionism as a political or theological view is not the same as I'm not going to go into the land of Israel, I'm not going to live in Eretz Yisrael. And the descendants of the what they call the old Yishuv, the Perushim, the descendants of the students of the Vilna Gaon, the descendants of the Hasidim. Some of them effectively became religious Zionists, some of them joined the Agudah, but some of them remained part of the anti-Zionist world. And many of the descendants still live in areas that we associate with that world, Me'esh Orim and the like. And they had no problem living in Eretz Yisrael because they saw themselves as living in Eretz Yisrael, not connecting to the state of Israel. So there certainly were, and there's a very large Satmar presence in Eretz Yisrael to this day.
There was a very large view from the rabbis that not to go to Israel at any cost. And there's a famous speech of, I think, El's Rebbe's brother.
Yes, yeah.
And which they then censored it out of the.
Yes, I did speak about it when I spoke about Das Torah a little bit, and I spoke about it there reluctantly. Also, I only did it because someone asked me to. It might have been you, I don't remember. So someone asked me to speak about it. Yes, I mean, absolutely. There's a lot of. Again, it's a very interesting discussion to look at. Pre-war oppositions going to Israel, pre-war oppositions going to America, by the way, also, of course, is it the Golden Medina, is it the Trefa Medina? And again, how with hindsight to look back on things and to what degree, we're being unfair because it's easy to be clever with hindsight, and to what degree there's the whole story of the train. Again, these are very, very complicated episodes. For now,
asked to go as a witness to help with Kastner, he refused. He said it wasn't the Zionists, although he got the certificate from the Zionists. He said it wasn't the Zionists that saved me, it was God.
Yeah. What I will say is I want, and I said this at the beginning, I want to, in a sense, keep this away from personalities and just talk about ideas, because these things are so difficult, and again, to judge people by how they behave in the desperation of you don't need to tell me that, you know that better than I do. I mean, these are. Okay, so this was the viewpoint of the Satmar Rav, and again, I just want to conclude by saying so that there's no misunderstanding around this. We're talking here about a very, very significant Jewish leader. No one should, God forbid, make that mistake, the mistake of thinking otherwise. We can be very, very profoundly opposed to a viewpoint, but we shouldn't rewrite history, and we should recognize this is one of the very significant post-war architects of the revival of the Jewish people. All I'm saying for now is that certainly 80 years on, it becomes ever increasingly problematic, and there's an ever greater gulf between the reality on the ground and the Hashkafic. In my humble opinion, it becomes very, very hard to see it as a meaningful viewpoint. This is a comment about this version of anti-Zionism, modern anti-Zionism or neutrality, or a viewpoint that it's not a halachic concept at all. It's simply a function of a sociological solution, which either will work or not work, can remain in its position despite the flourishing of the modern state of Israel. But an extreme version of anti-Zionism, which we see as a sort of expression of raw danger and evil, becomes problematic. Let's move on to Rav Kook's theology, because I really would like to try and cover some more grounds here. Now, Rav Kook has a number, and again, just for the interest of accurate historical record, Rav Kook is certainly not the only significant religious Zionist figure. There are many others, Rav Reines and Shmuel Moliver, and many, many others. I again also want to distinguish between the sort of modern religious Zionist viewpoint and its earliest iteration, the Kivush Eretz movement, and those that came even beforehand, like the Aliya of the Talmidim of the Vilna Gaon and the Baal Shem Tov. Again, listen to my first couple of shiurim where I distinguish between these theologies. For now, I'm talking about a sort of modern religious response to Zionism. Now, Rav Kook adopted a number of positions. The first position, he said, is that in and of in itself, the idea of Judaism being expressed as a state, on a national level, is one that as religious Jews, we should be excited by. Now, as that goes, that's not really a controversial statement. The Torah has expects of us to express our Judaism on a personal level. On a tzibur level, there are certain halachas which are a chovas tzibur, a communal obligation when there's a minyan that individuals can't do. There are also societal mitzvahs. If you have a city, there's Jewish city obligations to set up a shul and a school and a mikveh and various other things. And then there are national mitzvahs. We know that. So you open a Rambam and you see there's national mitzvahs as rules of shoftim, of setting up a Sanhedrin, a melech, a novi, how society should run. Judaism is meant to have national values, and it's meant to express itself nationally. That the idea that we are a nation and should be expressing ourselves nationally in and of in itself is not controversial. The debate starts about how can this be done in a pre-Messianic era. the first point Cook makes is this is a good thing. So why should we wait for Mashiach to try and engage with it? Where do we find that this isn't something that we should try and engage with Jewishly, even pre-Mashiach? We do find iterations of Jewish states post-Mashiach. We find there was some level of Jewish autonomy in the lands of Israel post the destruction of the temple. We find Bar Kokhba revolt. We find Vard Abba Arotzus in East Europe, in which there's a sort of semi-autonomous government of sorts. We find that whether it's mythical or true isn't the point, but we find the Rishonim dealing respectably with the idea of the Khazar kingdom, the Khuzari, and the like. So we don't find that there's a reason why the opportunity presents itself for us to express ourselves nationally that we shouldn't so do, even in the pre-Messianic era. And he deals with some of the problems raised about the three Shavuos and other such things. He's not too concerned with them. And as I mentioned, many mainstream thinkers aren't. It's not, certainly post the Balfour Declaration, this isn't a rebellion against the nations. The world powers, the League of Nations has recognized our right to a national state. We don't need to be concerned with this. Point one. Point number two is that he sees this return to Zion as the foundation stone, the building blocks upon which the Messianic era will be built. So this isn't just a return to Zion and the building of a national state, but since this is the building of a national state in the land of Israel, in Eretz Yisrael, with a significant and ever-growing percentage of the Jewish population there, this is the part or the first stage of the long dreamt of Kibbutz Goliath, of the return of the exiles, Me'arba Kanfus Oretz, from the four corners of the earth. This is it. This is the beginning of the Messianic era, the beginning of the return. Now, there are various sources, and we'll come to some of them shortly, that deal with what the return to Eretz Yisrael will look like, what the return to the lands of Israel will look like, and the idea of there being a third return to Eretz Yisrael. But basically, the Gemara and the Midrashim, based on Psukim in Zechariah, Pasuk in Zechariah in Perek Yud Gimel, that the third time we will remain in Eretz Yisrael. There's been one destruction, there's been a second destruction, but there won't be a third destruction. There are sources that talk about the number of Jews that need to come back to the lands of Israel for it to cross that critical mass, for this to be viewed as the third return. Some of them speak about it as the same size as the second return. Second return was Ezra. How many Jews came back to Eretz Yisrael in the second return? About 45,000. So we're radically beyond that. There's a Medrash Yalkut Shimoni that talks about Shishim Riboy, like the first entry into Eretz Yisrael, 600,000. Well, we're radically beyond that. Even if Shishim Riboy is understood to be 2 million, by the time you take into account people are old and younger, we're radically beyond that. So Rav Kook says, look, open your eyes. This is clearly the dawn of the third return. And we need to read history correctly and understand, number one, the idea of a Jewish nation state is a fantastic thing. Number two, this is the foundation, the building blocks of not just any nation state, Jewish nation state, but the one we're longing for, the return of the building of the Messianic era. Now, he faces a number of problems with these claims. The first problem is, will this state indeed be a Jewish state? To what degree will it run al-pi halacha? Number one. Number two, it is being founded and it is being built by leaders, many of whom are profoundly secular, many of whom are not just non-halachic, but profoundly anti-halacha. Again, I'm not going to go through the whole history of secular Zionism, but we know that there are numerous streams and strands within it, but a significant strands within it is quite a far left, sort of secularist vision. Certainly many of the youth who are sort of going up and pioneering and rebuilding the land of Israel are throwing off their kippot, throwing off their standards of tzniut. They're rejecting Torah. This is, how is it feasible that the Messianic era should be built through such a mechanism? And the third question Rav Kook faces is this in line with what we've traditionally been told about the process of ikvasod Mashiach, the footsteps of Mashiach, the beginning of the Messianic era. Do we find such things? Surely the Messianic era is built by Melech Mashiach riding into town on a Midrashim on his donkey, miracles being performed, the wars of Gog and Magog, and the Beis HaMikdash descending from Shamayim. Surely this is what Mashiach is meant to look like. Is this even in line with how the Messianic era is meant to be built? So Rav Kook and his students develop answers to these questions. And again, these are elaborate and long topics, but very briefly, is every Jewish state in history, has it always been a halachic state? Well, we know that the Hashmonaim, which was perhaps our most recent example of independence, in many aspects took on non-halachic forms. They adopted the kingship title for themselves, even though they were initially, of course, in line with halacha. We look back to the era of the first Beis HaMikdash. Certainly the Jewish state of the rebels, what we call Israel, the 10 tribes who break away from the Davidic dynasty, from the descendants of the house of David. Many of them are counter-halachic. Even within Beis David, you have kings who are righteous and pious, like Chizkiyahu and Yeshayahu, and you have others who are Menashe, who are very deeply problematic. Is it true to say that something ceases to be a Jewish state, an halachic state, because it is in breach of halacha? We certainly don't find that. Now, one can question the comparison. These were states that were set up initially, al pi nevuah, initially based on halacha, and then deteriorated. On the other hand, they did end up in many situations as states that were not operating in line with halacha. And nonetheless, these were still, we don't talk about this being an end of the Jewish state because there was a Jewish king who engineered the apparatus of government to cause people to move towards Avodah Zarah and the like. And on the contrary, we find the Nevi'im still giving kavod and honor and treating these figures as halachically having the status of Malchei Yisrael or Malchei Yehuda, as the kings of Yisrael and Yehuda. And no one suggested that they lose their halachic status. Being a king in halacha, Som Tasim Alech Melech, is a halachic status, and they maintain the halachic status despite their very problematic behavior in many cases. Yes.
Because they didn't.
Yes.
That's why we were.
Absolutely. So we still have a theological problem here, which is really, is this how the Messianic era is going to dawn, led by these mechutzofim, these chutzpahdik rebels, and is this really how it's going to work? And here come on to Rav Kook's, the second stream of his thinking, which is Rav Kook is a Volozhiner. He's a product of the yeshiva of Volozhin. He is very heavily influenced by Lithuanian Kabbalah, which had been under the surface, but there certainly since the time of the Vilna Gaon. He also perhaps has some Hasidic influence. Biologically, he has Hasidic blood in his veins. He is half Hasidic, and he adopts quite a Kabbalistic worldview. Now, part of the worldview of Kabbalah, in counter-distinction to the Maimonidean view, is to see good in everything, to see a spark of Kedusha in everything, to see Yiddishkeit, Judaism, as not about distancing ourselves from the material or the physical, but elevating it. And they speak about everything in existence having a spark. The idea of a spark, this metaphor, this Kabbalistic metaphor of a nitzitz of Kedusha, of a spark of Kedusha, a spark of sanctity, is the idea that it's not yet a roaring flame. It's not yet a fire that's raging, but it has a spark. It can set something alight. And whenever you see darkness, see it as potential for light. On the contrary, the darker something is, the greater a little spark of light has. It's able to light us up. If in this little room a spark was lit, we wouldn't notice it. If this room was dark, in a flash of a spark, we're capable of perceiving the whole room for a moment. The greater the evil, the more potential for good there is there. So Rav Kook builds a theology which plays into strands of thinking in Kabbalah. In a moment, we'll see potentially dangerous strands of thinking in Kabbalah, but strands of thinking in Kabbalah, which actually says, you know what, we're making a mistake if we just look at things in strictly halachic terms. And yes, these kids who are throwing off their Judaism and rebelling against their parents and marching off to the land of Israel and not keeping anything whatsoever, but these are wonderful children. They have a strong burning sense of Jewish identity, and they are most nefesh, are sacrificing their lives for Judaism and for saving Jewish lives. We need to start looking at the good. Is it really true to say that these are Rishayim, these are evildoers, these are terrible people? notice the good within them, and all we have to do is elevate that spark of goodness, and magically this will turn into a forceful good. Now, the opponents of Rav Kook accuse him of naivism, and it is a fair criticism in a sense. Rav Kook is an idealist. He's not he is the Rav of significant towns like Jaffa and later Yerushalayim, later becomes the chief rabbi of Israel, but he is an idealist, and even his closest supporters acknowledge that he looks in life with rose-tinted lenses as an under exaggeration. He saw everything positively. So his opponents say this is naive. They also say this is dangerous because this can end up as antinomianism, as a philosophy that rejects halacha. Don't forget the same accusation is made against the early Hasidic movement, which also talks quite similarly about seeing the good within evil. If it's true that we need to see the good within evil, but if we take that too far, perhaps we start forgetting what isn't allowed, and therefore it's dangerous. And this is the second accusation thrown against Rav Kook. But ultimately, his stature is such that even his opponents recognize we're talking about a Gadol Yisrael, we're talking about an exceptionally great man, and one who is a supreme master of halacha himself, very, very significant halachic authority, certainly no proponent of anything akin to antinomianism, and someone who succeeds in elevating Jews. He is a one-man kiruv machine. Also, besides everything else, he draws near to him many of the intellectuals of the early Zionist movement. He's a profoundly spiritual person, an exceptionally impressive figure who inspires people, and of course acts upon his dream. He engages in this famous tour of the kibbutzim, along with many of his ultra-Orthodox opponents, incidentally, because on this they agree that trying to reach out to our brothers and sisters in the settlements is a good thing. And he remains actually, and this is another example of where the terms we use nowadays don't quite fit, he remains part of the ultra-Orthodox world till the day of his death. He doesn't think of this as being a non-ultra-Orthodox ideology. He thinks of this as being religious Zionist ultra-Orthodoxy, and there's anti-religious Zionist ultra-Orthodoxy. He doesn't see this as a split that sort of should be a defining feature of streams of orthodoxy. He is very much, in a sense, very much part of the old Yishuv, at the same time as being a figure that reaches out to the new Yishuv and to the religious Zionists. So he argues in brief that a national state is a good thing, that such a national state can be built, maybe not ideally, but can be built even by those who in many other respects are far from Judaism, that we have a religious obligation to engage with it. And if you're troubled by the fact that it isn't currently a religious expression of nationalism, well, great, go and make it a religious expression of nationalism. He argues that if you can read history, you will see that this is the long-awaited beginning of the return to Zion. He argues that theologically, even these figures who seem to be very far from Judaism, in essence, this is just a coating, this is just a clipper, this is just a shell, and it can be cast off, and you will see the pure light of their neshamas, their souls shining through, and therefore we shouldn't see the fact that this is superficially led by people who are distant from traditional Judaism as telling us something profound about the nature of the movement, and this is a movement that we need to embrace and elevate. Finally, before we come back to his reading of history, he also argues that this is in line with traditional sources about how Geula can occur. There are other redemptions that don't occur in such a black and white manner, of a Beis Mikdash descending from heaven. Look at the return to Eretz Yisrael of Ezra, which we mentioned before, the building of the second Beis Mikdash. Many of the figures that are there in Eretz Yisrael are less than reputable. Read the latest books, the last books of Kesuvim, to the degree that in many respects Bovel, that consisted of those who didn't come back to Eretz Yisrael, was a greater Mokum Torah and had greater clarity of yichus of the Jewish people and less into marriage. This isn't the first time this happened. We mentioned the Hanukkah story already. Geula can happen in stages and in steps. And indeed, if you look at the Rambam himself, who is the closest we have to a posek, a halachic authority that addresses the era of Mashiach, recognizes steps in the process of the Messianic era happening. It's not as if it's this sort of instant magical moment in which there's great clarity achieved. Now, it is true if you look in the Rambam does speak about a figure, Melech HaMashiach, an individual Melech HaMashiach, and it won't be the Messianic era till there is an individual, the Melech HaMashiach, but nonetheless, the process is one that you do see in the Rambam, and the Rambam certainly was of the view that this was a process that took place in an ostensibly naturalistic way. The Melech HaMashiach will inspire people, he will bring people back to Torah, he will win military victories, but fought in a military way without open miracles. We're not going to see, at least initially, a Kriyas Yamsuf or 10 plagues or anything of that sort. This can be something that takes time. And the Rambam even talks about a period of doubt in which it's not clear that this is the Mashiach until the Mashiach establishes a sort of chazakah, a default assumption that this is Mashiach. Now, again, I'm not arguing, and of course wasn't arguing, that the Rambam is describing exactly what has occurred with the building of the state of Israel. The Rambam himself is to a degree vague. The Rambam himself is very cautious about all these things. He says we don't really know what will happen. In fact, the Rambam is sufficiently vague that another movement which claims to read the Rambam successfully is that of Chabad. And within Chabad, the Messianic wing of the Chabad said, no, you read the Rambam, you see it's clearly describing our Rebbe. So no one is claiming that the Rambam is a sort of a decisive source that evidently describes this iteration of the return to Zion. But certainly the Rambam is an important source against this idea of it being an open miracle event, and certainly it's legitimate within Jewish sources to see it as a process which can have a naturalistic beginning and something like this sort of founding of a state and building from that. Sorry, did you want to ask me? Okay, so this is how he answers the questions. What leads, just in terms of reference, because I'm not going to have time to go through this, the Rambam is in Hilchos Teshuvah. The Rambam speaks about what the Messianic era will look like. I think we spoke, I think we then dealt with the era of Mashiach once actually in this forum. We've dealt with this. So I did look at it from another angle, and the other Rambam is in Melachim, the Laws of Kings, Perek Yud Aleph, where again the Rambam talks about the era of Mashiach and says some of these sources. What do we know about what the dawning of Ikvus of the Mashiach, or the footsteps of Mashiach, will look like? Very, very limited amounts, but Rav Kook argued that the little bit that we know seems to fit, and uncannily so, he says. So the Gemara, well, first of all, I suppose I should introduce before I say anything else. Gemara Pesachim Nun Daled on the base says that we don't really know. It's a very closely guarded secret what the era of Mashiach will look like and how it will happen. However, there is a Gemara in Sota which says some interesting things, including that Chutz V'Yaski, that there will be an impudence, a cheek in the world at the era of Mashiach. And there's a Gemara in Sanhedrin, which we'll look at in a few moments later, which also sort of seems to speak similarly. The Gemara in Sota says that the young will disrespect the old. So if Cook looks at what's going on in the early era of Zionism, in which it's being led by the youth, it's a youth movement. The pioneers are these youths who are bravely the Chalutzim, going off to the land of Israel, many times rejecting all that is old, tragically, right? Everything that is old. And he says, well, this is the Gemara in Sota that tells us that this is what will happen. It talks about wars. It talks about destitution. It talks about the tzaddikim being despised, the chachomim being disrespected, and this is all part of the era of Mashiach in some of the negative sense of the word. It also speaks about positive things that are happening. It talks about a return of Talmud Torah, and it talks, of course, primarily based on Pesukim, really, about a flourishing of the land. That the land will be fruitful again, that after years of devastation and desolation, the Eretz Yisrael will bloom again. In fact, the Gemara in Sanhedrin says that if you want the clearest sign of the era of Mashiach, all these others are a bit vague. There's always wars, there's always chutzpah. Old people always moan about young people not respecting them. But the clearest sign of all, says the Gemara in Sanhedrin, is the Pasuk in Cheskel that Eretz Yisrael will bloom again. That it will be full again of fruit and agriculture and so on. And we know that, again, Eretz Yisrael is devastated. If you go back to the year 1870, it's malaria-ridden, it's marsh-ridden. A famous quote, I think, from Herbert Samuel, that he reckons it can sustain 50,000. Is that the quote? He says 50,000 souls. This is a land that no more than 50,000 people can live on without starving to death. There'll be simply famine. This is an absolute wreck. The Ramban already mentions when he gets to Eretz Yisrael how I mean, this is not miracle. This is al derech hateva. When no one maintains lands, it begins falling apart, and suddenly it returns. This is the clearest sign of the return of Ikvus of the Mashiach. And then he quotes various. These are classic sources. These are Gemaras. And then he quotes various mystical sources. There's a number of Zohars that talk about the signs of return of Mashiach. By the way, these Zohars are recognized even by, they go well beyond Rav Kook. These are sources that are quoted by many other sources. Again, I'm not going into the origins of the Zohar and the like. I'm just quoting what the Zohar says, which talks about the gates of wisdom and well springs of wisdom being opened around this time in history, linking it to the technological revolution and the beginning of the spreading of Kabbalah. The Baal Shem Tov has a very significant stream of thought in which he speaks about your futzumayna secha chutza, that when the well springs of Hasidus begin spreading in the world, this has become a significant part of Chabad theology. So all the signs are adding up this is the beginning of the return to Zion, the long-formed ikvasa to Mashiach. So this is the presentation of Rav Kook's viewpoint. Now, where do we go with this? How do we deal with this viewpoint? So again, I think significant figures that we would associate with religious Zionism have been a little skeptical about all of this, meaning to say that this is an optimistic reading of history, but we have to be cautious to what degree we are able to read history at all. Do we really have that certainty? I mean, we can hope, we can long, we can dream. We certainly have an obligation to recognize the miracles, to experience hakaras hatov and appreciation, to engage with the state, to see the potential of the vision of Rav Kook. But do we really know with certainty that this is going to be actualized? Can we be sure that out of this will be built the Messianic era? Could, God forbid, it go terribly wrong, particularly if we don't respond in the correct way? How certain can we be? To what degree can we read history? And it was in this very limited sense that I wanted to make a parallel between what I called the two sort of extremes of the theology, the extreme pro and the extreme anti. I don't mean to make that comparison in anything other than a limited way, that both of these viewpoints express a certainty in our ability to read history. And certainty in reading history is always a little dangerous. You know, predicting things is always a little bit difficult. And 80 years on from the foundation of the state of Israel, in many respects, Rav Kook's dream has been fulfilled. It is yet more prosperous, yet more fertile, yet a greater flourishing of Torah. And in many respects, it's still got very deep problems. It's still very difficult. There's been shrinking of Israel's borders. Many of the strong followers of Rav Kook, when Israel withdrew from Gaza, saw this as a breaking of the dream. I'm not commenting on the rights and wrongs of that. I'm simply saying that when you're trying to read history, it's quite difficult to know exactly where it will go and how to make predictions. And certainly for that reason, many who buy Bagadol into the optimism of a Rav Kook type vision are cautious about taking it too far, are cautious about saying with certainty, this is Reishit Tsemichat Geulatenu. This is certainly the beginning of the flourishing of our redemption. And here we get to perhaps the nuanced picture presented most closely, I'd say, by Rav Soloveitchik in his Kol Dodi Dofek, which was the name of his booklet that he wrote on this subject, taking as a metaphor the language of Shir HaShirim, which I think I mentioned when I spoke about the Satmar Rebbe's thinking, because of course Shir HaShirim is this extended allegory, as read by Chazal, of this very fraught relationship between the Jewish people, Hashem, the nations of the world, this complex dance of love and despair and appreciation and longing and frustration and rejection and so on, of which the Satmar Rebbe's quoted as really Gemara, three Shavuos as a part. But one of the metaphors used in Shir HaShirim is that of Kol Dodi Dofek. My lover is knocking at the door, and we now have a choice whether we open the door or not. And Shir HaShirim describes that, how the lady in the story is lying there, she's half asleep, she hears the knock at the door, she can't be bothered to get up, the knock happens again, it's her lover at the door, and he's saying, open up for me. She doesn't open up. Eventually, she thinks, you know what, I should really open up. She finally gets out of bed, she goes to open the door, and by then he's given up and he's gone. And it's trying to present this sort of tragedy of history knocking at the door, of opportunity knocking at the door, and us not noticing it. So Rav gives a sort of a moderated version of this dream, in which she says, I'm a brisker. I don't have this I'm not a mystic. I'm not Rav Kook. I don't have this ability to read history. I'm not going to make semi-prophetic claims about where history is going. I'm going to give a more modest aspiration. I'm simply going to say, this is some God knocking at the door. This is opportunity knocking at the door. And that's what religious Zionism should be. Religious Zionism should be an aspiration. It should be an engagement with the state of Israel and an appreciation and an openness to hearing what's going on, to seeing the opportunities, the miracles, the bracha that is inherent, having our hakaras hatov to it. Don't be in denial of it, like our brothers and sisters in moderate anti-Zionism. Don't, God forbid, read this as satanic forces, as in our brothers and sisters in extreme anti-Zionism. But I can't quite bring myself to read this with certainty as the dawning of the Messianic era. I prefer to say, let's make it into the dawning of the Messianic era. Let's buy into this project and let's try and build something out of it, because we can't refuse to engage with apparatus of state as perhaps the fear was that would be with Agudah in the pre-state era. Of course, we need to engage. We need to ensure there's a rabbanut. We need to ensure there's a rabbanut it. We need to have a proper message with it. We need to build it. We need to see the opportunity knocking at the door. We need to recognize and express our appreciation of it. It can't just be the passing of history that we're unaware of. We need to thank Hashem for this, whether through the rituals of a formal structure of Hallel or others. But this needs to be something that we are aware of. We need to hear Kol Zofik. But can I quite buy into the prophetic vision of Rav Kook? Can I say with certainty that this is the imminent and inevitable building and process of the third Beis Hamikdash? Halavai, if only, but we don't know that for sure. So this is a summary, and I'm rushing a little just because of time. This is a summary of what I would say is I think probably the mainstream compromise position of American Zionism and of a significant part of Israeli Zionism, religious Zionism. So in Israel, you have the Rav Kook world, which buys into a very Messianic vision. It has the strengths and weaknesses of all prophetic visions and Kabbalistic systems. There's a passion there. It's interesting, they almost explicitly label themselves as neo-Hasidic because there are commonalities with a Hasidic reading of history and this worldview in which ostensibly secular events are really battles between good and evil and the nitzotzes, the sparks that are emerging. And this is the passion that is found in that part of the religious Zionist world. And it also has some of the problems of prophecy and overconfident reading of history. And again, I want to emphasize, I'm not, God forbid, coming here to tar a whole movement. Like all other movements, is very, very nuanced. But this is, for those who follow the Israeli political scene, this is where there are the strands of some forms of extremism that are drifting into parts of that world, of aspects of extreme anti-Arab ideology or racism and so on. And I'm not making political comments here about visitors to the UK or about who says what and how large it is. I'm simply saying there is no doubt there are strands and threads going on which are part of the problem of Messianic and Kabbalistic movements, at the same time matched by an incredible fervor and inspiration and dynamism and enthusiasm. So this is the sort of lay of the land as I see it. And again, I'm not making comparisons between the two ends of the spectrum. I'm simply saying you have this Kabbalistic-driven religious Zionism and a Kabbalistic-driven extreme anti-Zionism, and you have right in the middle, a halachic neutrality, which has almost evaporated, by the way, very, very small remnants, but certainly in the early years of Zionism, as I mentioned in the first year, was a significant school of rabbinic thought, which is this isn't rabbinic or halachic or Hashkafic issue at all. And then you have moderate pro-Zionism, which is what I label as these terms are arbitrary, what we can call Soloveitchian religious Zionism or the like, which is a view of I see the potential here, we need to be alert and awake to the potential, but I'm not going to step into the territory of making certain predictions, and we're not going to have time to explore, because we've run out of time, what we can call the moderate anti-Zionism of the Kivush Yisrael, which has evolved into, probably on the grounds, a version of moderate pro-Zionism in recent years. Or the Levin tradition, or Hirschian anti-Zionism. There's so much more that we can say, but I do think we need to sort of bring this subject to a close. I'm just looking online at chat questions. Let me expand it and just see very briefly if there's any questions I have time to answer. Someone has asked, has the perspective of Kol Dodi been overtaken by more than 50 years of history? I don't think so, and I think this is the advantage of a moderate viewpoint. This is much better at dealing with historical circumstances, because it's less capable it's less tied to a particular outcome. Someone asked, are there any guarantees that countries like Iran will not be successful in their objectives? How do we view? Sorry. Sorry.
Not really your share.
What's not my share? Oh, guarantees. No. Okay. All I will say though is, because the person here is asking a theological question, which is it possible that the state of Israel could be destroyed theologically? So I'm not going to go into that because again, it's a very disturbing subject. I'll simply say that in Rav Kook's vision, no, because this is the building blocks of the Messianic era, so it's impossible. Interestingly, there's a very strong tradition amongst the Lithuanian Kabbalists and the followers of the Vilna Gaon that the settlement in Israel also cannot be destroyed, even though this is from movements that are probably in the moderate anti-Zionist spectrum or the Zionistly neutral spectrum. So there are very significant viewpoints that still read history in the same way. In other words, V'Hatzion Plato, the Pesukim in Zechariah about the third return. Very interestingly, they are happy to see this current return as the third return, even though they don't link that to the apparatus of secular Zionism and the State of Israel in the way that Rav Kook and Rav Soloveitchik were open to. So there's a tradition dating from the Chafetz Chaim. It was expressed by Reb Chaim Kanievsky in Bnei Brak about 20 years ago, and by many other thinkers in the Haredi world who are more skeptical about the apparatus of a secular government and secular State of Israel, and yet do buy in to the aspect that this is the third return and the final return, and that there will not be a destruction of the new Yishuv in Israel, the new settlements in Israel, even though they avoid labeling as the Medina, as the state itself. Again, in the rush time that we have, just an indication of how interlinked the viewpoints are, and almost anything that you hear which tries to be black and white around these subjects isn't really presenting the full range of theology, because I've mentioned you can have quite strong religious Zionists who don't think that theologically the survival of the State of Israel is guaranteed. And as everyone here squirms a bit as I said the word guaranteed for obvious reasons, which of us can offer guarantees? And you have parts of the moderately anti-Zionist school of thought who do think it's theologically guaranteed, and that I think best brings out the sort of strands and nuances. I will simply conclude with picking up on neo-Hasidism. Is that why Ashkenazim use Nusach Sfard in Israel? Ashkenazim in Israel, in the religious Zionist world, took on Nusach Sfard partly as a compromise in order to create peace between Ashkenazim, Hasidim, and Sfardim, and some of it was linked to the emergence of neo-Hasidus. Very, very interesting stuff. Maybe actually I can give a series on neo-Hasidus. Very interesting stuff going on in Israel and in America around neo-Hasidism in modern Orthodox world. But for now, I'll simply say that I think for all of us, certainly a metaphor of kol dodi dofek is one that, as a minimum, should be adopted. We definitely need to hear when Hashem knocks at the door and respond in time and in accordance to that knock at the door, not just in this area, but in every area of our religious and spiritual lives. And I will stop there for today. So that's been a little bit of a rush to finish, but I hope that gives a little bit of a conclusion. And thank you very much to everyone online.
Thank you.
It's a resurgence of interest in the